Most people think attachment begins when someone becomes important to you. It doesn't. Attachment usually begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment you start giving someone the benefit of the doubt more often than they deserve. The moment their behavior starts receiving explanations that nobody else's behavior would receive. The moment their silence feels different from everyone else's silence. At first, it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels natural. You meet someone, and unlike most people, they seem genuinely interested. Conversations don't feel forced. Hours disappear without effort. They ask questions nobody else asks. They notice details most people overlook. They remember things you barely remember mentioning yourself. And without realizing it, you begin associating their attention with something much larger than attention. You begin associating it with significance. Suddenly, their messages carry more emotional weight than anyone else's. Their opinions matter more. Their reactions matter more. Their presence changes the atmosphere of your day. The connection feels exciting because it feels rare. At least that's what you tell yourself. What most people don't realize is that attachment rarely arrives with intensity. It arrives with consistency. Day after day, interaction after interaction, someone slowly becomes woven into your emotional routine until their presence stops feeling optional. And that is usually where the first blind spot appears. Because once someone becomes emotionally important, objectivity quietly starts disappearing. At first, nothing seems different. The conversations are still good. The energy is still there. The attention still feels mutual. But human behavior rarely changes overnight. It changes gradually. So gradually that attachment often notices the change while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge it. One evening, they reply a little later than usual. Nothing serious. You barely think about it. The next day feels normal. Then it happens again. A little more distance. A little less curiosity. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm. Just enough to create a feeling you can't quite explain. Most people recognize that feeling immediately. The problem is that attachment teaches them not to trust it. Instead of asking why the energy feels different, they start constructing explanations. Maybe work is stressful. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're dealing with something personal. Maybe you're imagining things. And because every explanation sounds reasonable, the growing discomfort gets pushed aside. Not because it disappeared. Because it became easier to ignore. Weeks pass this way. The connection still exists, but something about it feels slightly different. You notice you're initiating more conversations. You notice you're carrying more of them too. Topics that once developed naturally now require effort. Moments that once felt spontaneous now feel scheduled. Yet every time your instincts try to raise concern, attachment steps in like a defense attorney arguing against reality. You focus on the good days. The occasional long conversation. The random moments of affection. The evidence that allows hope to survive. And slowly, something dangerous begins happening. You stop evaluating the relationship based on its current reality. You start evaluating it based on its history. That distinction seems small. It isn't. Because history can become emotional camouflage. The memories of how someone treated you yesterday can make it surprisingly difficult to see how they're treating you today. That's why attachment creates blind spots. Not because people become incapable of seeing change. Because they become emotionally invested in not fully accepting it. Eventually, the changes become harder to ignore. You send a message and immediately place your phone down, pretending not to care. 10 minutes later, you check. Then 20 minutes later. Then an hour later. You tell yourself you're just curious. But deep down, you're waiting for reassurance. The reply eventually arrives. Short. Polite. Nothing technically wrong with it. Yet somehow it feels different. Not enough to justify concern. Just enough to create disappointment. And that disappointment begins appearing more often. The frightening part is how quickly people adapt to emotional deprivation when attachment is involved. Things that would have bothered them months ago suddenly become acceptable. A cancelled plan becomes understandable. A forgotten promise becomes forgivable. A lack of effort becomes temporary. A lack of enthusiasm becomes stress. A lack of attention becomes busyness. Attachment has an answer for everything. And that's why it becomes so difficult to see what's happening. The blind spot isn't created by ignorance. It's created by interpretation. Every uncomfortable reality gets translated into something less threatening. Until eventually the relationship exists more inside your explanations than inside the actual behavior itself. And that's where emotional imbalance begins taking control. You notice yourself becoming more careful. More calculated. You reread messages before sending them. You remove sentences that sound too needy. You hesitate before bringing up concerns. You convince yourself that timing matters. Tone matters. Word choice matters. What you're actually afraid of is becoming inconvenient. Because somewhere along the way, preserving the connection became more important than expressing yourself honestly. Most people don't notice when this shift happens. They only notice the consequences. They notice that they're anxious more often. They notice that their confidence feels weaker. They notice that a single message can improve their mood while a delayed reply can quietly ruin an entire evening. The emotional center of gravity has moved. And now their sense of stability depends on someone else's attention. That's when attachment becomes particularly dangerous. Because the more emotionally dependent someone becomes, the more expensive honesty starts feeling. You don't want to acknowledge what you see. You don't want to acknowledge what you feel. Because every uncomfortable observation threatens something you've become emotionally attached to preserving. Then one day, something happens that forces comparison. Maybe you're sitting together when their phone lights up. Maybe you're scrolling through social media. Maybe you're simply paying attention. But suddenly you notice them responding to someone else with an energy they haven't shown you in a long time. The replies are quicker. The curiosity feels effortless. The enthusiasm feels genuine. For a brief moment, reality becomes impossible to avoid. Not because they did anything wrong. Because you suddenly remember what their attention used to feel like. And the contrast is impossible to ignore. That moment lingers. Not for hours. For weeks. Because attachment doesn't fear rejection as much as it fears replacement. The possibility that someone else now receives the energy you once received creates a kind of emotional panic that is difficult to describe. You begin searching for evidence. Comparing conversations. Analyzing behavior. Replaying interactions. Trying to determine whether the change is real or imagined. But deep down, you already know the answer. You've known it for a while. That's what makes attachment so unsettling. It often forces people to spend months arguing against conclusions they reached long ago. The signs were there. The distance was there. The shift was there. The only thing missing was acceptance. And acceptance feels dangerous because acceptance requires grieving something before it officially ends. Most people would rather stay uncertain. Uncertainty allows hope to survive. Hope allows attachment to survive. And attachment will often choose survival over clarity. Until one day the truth becomes impossible to negotiate with. The conversations are different. The connection is different. The emotional atmosphere is different. What once felt effortless now feels maintained. What once felt mutual now feels managed. And suddenly every ignored moment begins connecting together like pieces of a puzzle you spent months refusing to assemble. The delayed replies. The fading curiosity. The shrinking effort. The emotional distance. The blind spots were never hiding reality. They were protecting you from it. That realization is often more painful than the change itself. Because you discover that your instincts were not wrong. You noticed the shift much earlier than you allowed yourself to admit. You saw the signs. You felt the difference. You sensed the distance. But attachment convinced you that seeing wasn't the same as believing. So you kept explaining. Kept justifying. Kept waiting. Kept hoping. Until reality became impossible to rewrite. And maybe that's the darkest part about attachment. Not that it makes people love blindly, but that it makes people protect illusions long after their instincts have already recognized the truth. The connection doesn't always disappear all at once. Sometimes it fades slowly enough for attachment to build explanations around every missing piece. And by the time the blind spots finally disappear, the truth has often been standing there for months, quietly waiting to be acknowledged. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.